All right, and welcome back. This is the final part 4 of chapter 6. And in the next learning objective, we're going to be determining the level of sales we need in order to attain a specific level of profit. So in these examples, it's best, I think, to think of your CEO coming to you and saying, look, how many bikes or whatever it is your company sells, how many bikes do I need to sell in order to obtain X amount of profit next month because I have to, because the board of directors or the stockholders are all demanding that I make X amount. So I want you to consider yourself in real world situations like that. And you can compute the number of units that need to be sold using either method. And the book explains both of these, the equation method or the formula. Don't worry about the difference, really. They're all found on that handout that I gave you, which is slide number 1 for chapter 6 handouts. So use whichever one you prefer. The homework problem and the exam will ask you to use, actually I won't ask you on the exam, but the homework problem will ask you to use specific ones so you get used to using each. But what I say is use whichever one is easiest for you on that slide and handout. I've created that handout for your simplicity, but it's real important that you do understand how they are all interrelated and how in essence they are all the exact same equation. Anyway, let's get started with the equation method first. And again, since we are trying to find out the number of units that we need to sell, our goal is to solve for the unknown Q, right? The quantity of units that need to be sold in order to attain a specific target that will be given to us. And by the way, this equation can be found on handout number 1 for chapter 6, down in the per unit amount section down on the bottom. You'll notice that it's separated into two, total dollar section up top and per unit amount equations down on the bottom. So remember, our goal is to solve for the unknown Q, which represents the quantity of units that need to be sold. We just need to plug in everything else. So suppose in this example that management or a CEO comes over and wants to know how many bikes need to be sold in order to earn a profit of $100,000. Well, all we need to do is plug in all the amounts that we know and solve for the one unknown variable, which is Q in this example, right? We already know what the target profit is that we want. He just told us, $100,000. We know what the fixed expenses are. Again, this all comes from handout number 2, which shows our baseline information for RBC Bicycle Company. That's $80,000. And we know what our unit contribution margin is. That's $200. So if we plug in all those numbers first and then just use algebra, right, to isolate that unknown variable very simply. If we're adding or subtracting the $80,000, we move it over to the other side of the equation. We'll be adding it, correct? If we are multiplying this $200 by our variable here, when we move it over to the other side of the equation, we'll be dividing by that $200. And now we've got it isolated by itself. Now remember, in algebra, we like to have that isolated variable on the left side and everything else on the right side. So all we do is just flip-flop it over and we've got it there and solve for it, right? Comes out to $900. Now, what the book calls the formula method is really the exact same thing, right? All that it's done, though, is already done the algebra for you, right? It's unit sales, which is basically the Q that we were solving for, is equal to the profit, target profit of $100,000 plus the fixed expenses divided by the contribution margin per unit. Let me back up one slide so you can see it. It's the exact same thing, right? Quantity is equal to our target profit plus our fixed expenses divided by the unit contribution margin. Same exact thing in the formula method. And that's what I mean by that slide has 7 different formulas and equations, which are really all the exact same thing, just expressed in different terms or in different levels of refinement. So use whichever one you feel more comfortable. Generally, the formula method will be easier just because all the moving around and isolating of variables is already done for you. So remember, if they're asking for the number of sales that you need to make based upon it to attain a target profit, generally the formula method, which is already done for you and is the last one on the slide under each section, total dollars or per unit amounts, will be the easiest one. So let's go ahead and plug in the exact same numbers there. We know what the target profit is. It's $100,000. We know what our fixed expenses are from the baseline information, and we know what our contribution margin is per unit. Simply do that simple arithmetic, and of course we come up to the number of bikes we need to sell in order to come up with a $100,000 profit. And that's that last formula equation listed on that slide. So hopefully you see what we've been doing as we go along in this lecture is really building up that slide and adding formulas and equations to this one slide that you're going to have. We can also compute target profit in terms of sales dollars, once again using either the equation method or the formula method. So now we're moving into total dollars amount, right? And our goal is going to be to solve for the unknown sales dollars, which represents the dollar amount of sales that we need to actually generate in order to attain the target profit. So assume in this example, manager comes over and wants to know the total sales revenue that needs to be generated in order to end up with a profit of $100,000. So we're starting with the equation method, right? And that is shown up here. The easiest one is profit is equal to contribution margin ratio multiplied by total sales dollars, subtract out your fixed expenses. Remember, we're trying to solve for total sales dollars, right? And since we're talking about total dollars, you're going to be looking at the top half of that slide, that handout that was given out, right? And this is the second equation that's listed there in the top half. So what we want to do, of course, is just plug in the numbers that we already know. We know what the target profit is. That's $100,000, right? That's what the manager is looking for. And we know what our contribution margin ratio is. It's 40%. Again, and that comes from slide number 2 that will be given to you. And we know what the fixed expenses are. Those are also given to you. That's $80,000. What we don't know is the total amount of sales that we'll need in order to generate that $100,000 of profit. So we'll simply plug those amounts in and try and isolate that one unknown variable of total sales dollars. And this is what it looks like sped up for you all, but basically plugging in the 100,000 target, the 40% contribution margin ratio, and those fixed expenses, then of course just use an algebra to isolate sales by itself, and this is what we end up with. So we need to generate $450,000 of revenue in order to end up with a target profit of $100,000. Moving over to the formula method, which is the exact same thing with all that algebra already done for you and that dollar sales figure, that unknown variable already isolated, but it's the exact same thing. All we'll be doing is plugging in these numbers that we already know and solving the simple arithmetic. Target profit is once again $100,000. Fixed expenses we know are $80,000. Add those up and then just divide by the 40% ratio. Very simply, $450,000. And this, of course, is on that handout slide, and this is the final product of the handout slide. And you'll see that we've now added this final formula or equation to this slide. So again, if the problem is asking you for total dollars, the manager comes over and wants to know how many total sales dollars or total revenue we're going to need to generate, you probably want to use one of these if they're talking about total dollars. If they're talking about a question or some sort of hypothetical involving units or per unit amounts, you're probably going to want to use one of these equations or formulas down here. Again, use whichever one you feel is easiest. I like the formula methods that are already written out for me because the algebra is already done. Make your life easy or challenge yourself, whichever you prefer. One last thing we'll talk about here is determining the break-even point, which is very critical in business because you need to know that, right? You can sustain some break-even. You don't want to sustain many losses, but you can sustain some break-even times when business is slow. So real important to know what that level is. And the equation method or the formula method can be used to determine either the unit sales or the total sales revenue that needs to be achieved in order to have a target profit of 0. And that's really key, is understanding that a break-even analysis is the same thing as a target profit analysis, but the targeted profit is simply 0. So How many bikes or units do you need to sell in order to have a profit of 0, right? Not a loss, not a gain. That's your break even. Or what are the total sales dollars that you need to generate in order to have a final profit, a net income of $0. So suppose we want to know how many bikes we need to sell in order to have a break even. All we do is input a 0 target profit into here. And this is once again using that equation method, using the same equation we used before when we were plugging in $100,000, but we'll now just be plugging in everything else. The unit contribution margin is $200, fixed expenses are $80,000, and then we just do the same thing and apply our algebra formulas. So profits are going to be 0 at the break-even point. We know that fixed expenses are $80,000 and our unit contribution is $200. Go ahead and solve doing the algebra, which is done for you here. Or another simple way to do it is by using that formula method, but your target profit, which you would generally take your target profit minus your fixed expenses, or excuse me, adding your fixed expenses, but here our target profit is 0. So it's just the fixed expenses divided by the contribution margin per unit. Real simple to calculate that one out. But we're really just using the exact same formula from the handout, which is down at the bottom part of your handout. Just remember, we're plugging in a $0 amount for the targeted profit in order to determine our break-even point. Same thing when we're working with total sales dollars. If we want to know the total sales revenue dollars that we need to generate in order to break even, we just plug in that $0 amount into the profit area. If we're using the equation method, this is what it would look like. We'd simply plug in those same numbers and use algebra to get to the final product. So our contribution margin ratio is 40%. Our fixed expenses are $80,000, and of course the target profit in a break-even analysis is $0. So once again, just using algebra where we're trying to isolate that one unknown variable of sales, we come up with $200,000. Let me show you very quickly under the formula method the exact same thing, except of course we're just leaving out the profit because the target profit is 0. So just plugging in those numbers, come up with the exact same amount. Again, use whichever formula you think is easiest from that handout that I gave you. Learning objective number 7, by the way, is presented in the chapter. Feel free to skim it. And by the way, if I won't test you on it, I won't have any homework questions on it, but if I ever leave anything out and you're interested in it, please, by all means, shoot me a message, give me a call, set up an appointment. I'll be happy to discuss it and help you learn it if you're interested in learning it. Hope you've enjoyed Chapter 6. We'll see you back here for the next chapter. Enjoy, folks.